Good evening, everybody. My name is Andrea Dean. On behalf of the Australasian Catholic Coalition for Church Reform, ACCC, and John Garrett Publishers, I welcome you to this evening's book launch via a Zoom webinar. In a webinar format, you will see the panelists' faces, but not all the participants. There will be an opportunity for you to submit questions later in the chat function, which will be only directed to the panelists. As we begin, let's acknowledge the Australian, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of the nation and the traditional custodians of the lands where we live, learn and work. We pay our respect to the elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture and hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across the nation. We acknowledge the deep spiritual attachment and relationship of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to this country and commit ourselves to the ongoing journey of reconciliation. The Australasian Catholic Coalition for Church Reform is a network of 20 organisations across Australia and New Zealand. Members are committed to the Catholic faith and seek renewal of their church. During 2021, ACCCR is concerned with a series, main concern is a series of convocations to promote the Australian Plenary Council and to support its task of church renewal. During the online convocations, keynote speakers have offered a path towards a vibrant synodal church that speaks to and meets the needs of the people of God. These convocations in turn were the genesis for this book, A Church for All, A Guide to the Plenary Council and Beyond. This prophetic publication presents transcripts from convocation speakers Joan Chittister, Robert Fitzgerald, Deborah Zanella and John Warhurst, and importantly, an ACCCR response to the Plenary Council agenda questions with concrete proposals. So as we begin tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Claire Victory. Claire is the National President of St Vincent de Paul Society and a Plenary Council member. She is a solicitor who began her involvement in the Society of St Vincent de Paul around the age of 10 years through her parish Young Vinnies group. During high school, she became heavily involved in running Vinnies youth programs for at-risk children and teenagers. Claire worked as a school liaison officer for the Society in South Australia from 2004 to 2007 and was on the Society's National 2008 World Youth Day Committee. She's been a member of the National Council since 2011. Claire tonight will explore the need for reform and our hopes for the plenary and beyond. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you for the invitation to help launch this enlightened and enlightening publication. And I'd like to acknowledge that I come to you tonight from the land of the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to the elders of this land. When I was a kid, our family was quite involved in the church in many ways. My parents were actively involved at many levels, and over time, my sisters and I became quite involved as well. And I remember a great sense of community, tradition and ceremony, of friends and role models, and of parish and family group social events. I grew up in Adelaide, and while I didn't realise it at the time, this particular archdiocese really shone a light on how the hard-won changes from the Second Vatican Council might come to life in grassroots church communities. Under the stewardship of Archbishop Leonard Faulkner and in consultation with his parishioners, The Archdiocese engaged women in decision-making roles, consulted widely with the lay community, informally and through various councils, some required under canon law and some not. And the Royal Commission nominated Adelaide as an exemplar in this respect. I'm still part of a positive church community. I became a member of Vinnie's, as you said, when I was 10 years old, and I've been actively engaged in the works of the Society ever since. And I've really come to see that as my vocation and my primary expression and involvement in my faith. I've been on the National Council since 2011 and am proud to be the youngest and the first female national president. I'm in the fortunate position of my age and gender having opened up opportunities for me rather than closing doors, and that includes in my involvement with the church. But I acknowledge that I also have the privilege by virtue of being a white, tertiary educated, straight, cisgender person, and that not everyone has found the church to be the place of welcome and belonging that I have. In many parts of the country, the inclusive circumstances which nurtured and inspired me as a child were clouded by the impact of misguided clericalism, the abuse of power, and of the sanctity of the institution above all else, as many sought to return the church to a bygone era. And the Royal Commission really laid bare the tragic results of that. Over 50,000 members and staff are part of the St Vincent de Paul Society family in Australia. And for many who have left the institutional church, working at the coalface with very vulnerable people is an authentic expression of their faith, bringing gospel values to life in the lives of people who need a hand up from time to time. One of our founders, Blessed Frederick Ozanam, whose feast day is today, wrote, "The knowledge of social well-being is learned not from books nor from public debate, but in climbing the stairs to the poor man's garret, sitting by his bedside, feeling the same cold that pierces him, sharing the secret of his lonely heart and troubled mind. When we know firsthand the conditions of the poor in school, at work, in hospital, in the city, in the country, everywhere that God has placed them, then and only then can we begin to grasp the elements of poverty and hope we may resolve it." In our recent submission to the Plenary Council, the St Vincent de Paul Society acknowledged the need for greater inclusion and an urgent recasting of church leadership and governance at every level of the church in Australia. The Plenary Council process is one opportunity for urgently needed cultural and systemic change, identified not just by the recent Royal Commission, but by faithful lay Catholics for decades. As the largest lay-led Catholic organisation in Australia, Vinnie's has a crucial role to play in the restoration of our church's credibility. To reform itself, the church must strive to be more representative of the community it seeks to serve. We want our church to be known for its commitment to the poor, not as passive recipients of our benevolence, but as people central to the church's life and mission. The Society strongly advocates for a church that condemns clericalism and promotes a more transparent and accountable model where hierarchical structures give way to shared leadership, where wisdom is sought through a process of genuine dialogue and inclusive vision. As Vincentians, we hope that this Plenary Council and the significant hard work that will follow will lead to a church that has a more deliberate, inclusive and intentional focus on its fundamental mission of following Christ by serving the poor. Reading this book, A Church for All, a guide to the Australian Plenary Council and beyond, gives me hope for the church that I love. It's an inspiring record of 2 historic convocations hosted by the Australasian Catholic Coalition for Church Reform, attended by thousands in the lead up to the 5th Plenary Council of the Church in Australia. Dr. Joan Chittister, Dr. Miriam Rowan Ungermar-Bauman, Deborah Zanella, Robert Fitzgerald, and Professor Emeritus John Warhurst all articulate in different ways the yearning for a different way of being church in the 21st century. Joan Chittister, through her guided tour of 8 biblical mountains, took us to Mount Olivet, the mountain of solidarity with the poor and oppressed. And today we still see it. We see the laity being church beyond ritual and rubric. She said, we must be people who recognise that it is not that we are church that is important. What is important is that we remember that we are what is left of the gospel in this changing time. She called for lay Catholics to be treated as equals, as seekers, as spiritual adults. Old styles of worship, old criteria of piety, old ways of relating to the world, good as all of them may once have been, cannot build for us a new Jerusalem in this place, in this time, when the forces of history face us with new challenges. She was dismissive of the Church's unequal treatment of women, querying why there should not be women deacons, priests, and cardinals. She observed that in a world that suppresses its women, the Church needs the presence of the other half of the human race. Catholicism must grow up, she said, beyond the parochial to the global, beyond one system and one tradition, to a broader way of looking at life and its moral, spiritual, ethical frameworks. Dr. Miriam Rose Ungermar Baumann opened the second convocation, sharing insight into her own culture, entreating us all to practice deep listening and to be courageous enough to find a way to adapt the learnings from the sessions to the future practices of the Church. We wait for the seasons to come and we sit in stillness, she said. When you deeply listen to people of other cultures, you learn to find similarities and respect for the differences. You become inclusive. In our culture, everyone belongs. We all have relationships with everyone through family and also skin relationships. Family, kinship, relationship. But we also have a connection, relationship, and respect for the land, which, if adopted, could bring about the peace that we also dearly strive for. Deborah Zanella called for a deconstruction of the underlying structures, beliefs, and systems that feed the current injustice. She said a church that is inclusive, diverse, and welcoming requires the total reformation of the structures that has prevented it from being such a church. You cannot tinker around the edges with small reforms that provide the appearance of change, but do nothing to change the underlying structures which have harmed and continue to harm and exclude the faithful. Drawing on his experience as a Child Sex Abuse Royal Commissioner, Robert Fitzgerald highlighted the desperate need for governance reform, articulated in the Light from the Southern Cross, and the tragic consequences of poor governance. He said one of the greatest challenges to renewal of our church is fear. It is often exploited by those who resist change and return to the status quo, he said. Hope can set us free to contemplate the possible. Renewal is born out of hope, not fear, he said. And likewise, good church governance must be based in hope, not fear. It must arise out of humility, not arrogance. It must be based in truth, not denial. In summing up, John Warhurst provided insight into the plenary council to date, but he was not optimistic. He said the plenary council process has been firmly top-down and exclusive. The energy for reform in the 17,500 submissions made early on in the process is largely absent from the final plenary council document. As he notes, this plenary council is not the only or even the main opportunity for reform, but it is an opportunity too good to overlook. This little publication is dense with wisdom and insight, with brave and prophetic statements and observations. And I truly hope that it will be read widely by people who are hanging on by their fingernails. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. That's fantastic. I love the fact that you were so grounded and aware and that you spotted those little gems of wisdom and insight and encouraged us all to find them. Thank you so much. Our next guest is Frances Sullivan. Frances is Chair of Catholic Social Services Australia, a plenary council member, as well as Chair of the Board at Mater Misericordia Limited. He is also Chief Executive Officer. He also was Chief Executive Officer at the Truth, Justice and Healing Council and Secretary General of the Australian Medical Association. Frances is committed to equity and justice and has been highly successful in bringing a social conscience to the political debate on health, aged care, and community service issues, Tonight, Francis will share his perspective on reform and renewal of the Australian Church. Welcome, Francis.
Thanks very much, Andrea, and to Garrett Publishing for giving me this opportunity tonight to share in the launching of this book. And make sure you all get it. One of the most exciting things for me about the mail in lockdown is the book arrived. So don't panic, get out there and order it. It'll turn up. But before I start, can I also recognise the Ngunnawal country on which I speak and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I just would like to spend a few brief minutes, if I could, reflecting on the fact that I'm going to be a delegate to the Plenary Council, along with Claire and John, as it turns out. And, grappling with the challenge of participating in what appears to be a very controlled, clerically dominant, cautiously scripted event. There's already been widespread bewilderment in the published agenda for the plenary. It appears to be very bland when compared to the 17,500 submissions and the impassioned discussions and dialogues over the last 3 years. Also, there is a sense of foreboding that the plenary discussions will be curtailed so that some of the difficult, some may say controversial issues won't be given serious airtime because they are beyond the remit of the Plenary Council. Frankly, this was not the invitation the bishops issued to encourage Catholics to embrace the plenary and get involved in the process. Back then, you may recall, everything was on the table. Somewhere along the line, someone has taken things off the table. It is hard to trust a process that changes the rules of engagement as it goes. Even up until today, some elements of the conduct of the assemblies are still unclear. Yet, we hang in there in good faith and with hope. With fingers crossed, we place our feet on the path. So, delegates to the Plenary Council are being asked to embrace a planned program of dialogue, deliberation, and determination, these days known as synodality. It is meant to be the preferred papal governance model for an emerging church. The working process is also meant to be prayerful reflection, discussion, consideration, and consensus for the common good. This will be how discernment plays out in practice. But as lay people particularly, being thrust into this new model will have its moments, but not just for ourselves. Even archbishops have been quoted as saying, well, we don't really know what discernment is and we don't really know what synodality is. Well, that gives us a lot of hope, only 4 weeks out from starting. Pope Francis sees the approach as the vehicle for the church to shed itself of outmoded customs and structures, to adopt a humble, non-clericalist attitude, and to embark on a missionary as opposed to propositional agenda. Certainly from what I've been through in the last few years, I figure he's spot on. Pope Francis sets out a simple formula for this transition. He says, firstly, discern reality, then debate ideas. Undoubtedly, this is our moment to face realities. Only the naive would think that our church is not in crisis. Around 90% of Catholics no longer regularly attend weekend worship. Large swathes take issue with current church positions on matters of sexuality, marriage, gender identity. They speak of disaffection, disinterest, even discrimination from a church too rigid and too reactionary to resonate with their heartfelt sense of personhood and goodness. Unless there is a sincere effort to acknowledge and breach this chasm, our common project is doomed. And that common project is to be authentically Catholic in following the gospel. A movement of Catholics, if you will. From its earliest understandings, to practice Catholicism is to seek wholeness and unity across differences. It's to participate in the divine juggle. That is, we believe that God's life is in ours, with all our diversity and plurality, and that we achieve wholeness together, not apart. And the key is this: our unity, our Catholicism, is not about insistence on conformity. Rather, it is to value our differences as human beings, not to seek to reduce human life to a normative straitjacket where some are legitimate Catholics and some are not. It's to build bridges, not walls of exclusion, to be welcoming of diversity, not to be judgmental, to embrace equality amongst the baptized, not instill privilege and entitlement. This is a style of Catholicism that can be missionary, that can be relevant in a world cynical of religious ideologues and cultural warriors. This is the style of Catholicism that humbly acknowledges that it doesn't have all the answers, doesn't sit in judgment of others, doesn't seek to abandon the frontiers of human endeavour, development and inquiry out of fear, suspicion or prejudice. I put it to you that this spirit, which seeks inclusion, equality and fraternity, undergirds the contributions to this volume. As Claire Victory so eloquently outlined, all the contributors speak from a deep spiritual insight with hearts of fire for the gospel message and its unfolding challenges. They give voice to the cries of ordinary Catholics for a vibrant, relevant church, one they can recognise as being a reflection of their lives and circumstances, one that feels responsive and understanding, compassionate and nurturing, brave and prophetic, exciting and free. Delegates to the Plenary Council will be asked to develop tangible proposals for the Church in Australia, ways to put the sentiments I have expressed and the style of Catholicism that most reflects its origins into effect. They will need ideas to discuss once they acknowledge our present reality. A Church for All offers a pathway for that work. It is a prayerful consideration of our current circumstances within the framework of deliberation provided by the Plenary Council. It is completely consistent with our tradition of theological reflection and discernment. It provides multiple tangible proposals that are aimed at being a missionary, vibrant church. The Australian Catholic Coalition for Church Reform, along with Joan Chittister, Deborah Zanella, Robert Fitzgerald, and John Warhurst, are the beacons of hope in the wider church conversation that so easily can be constrained by inertia and a lack of imagination. When I read their contributions, I feel a sense of excitement and possibility. I dream again that change can happen. Pope Francis speaks of a change in era. The change may not come easily. It may well come messily. We need to gird our loins for the change that is coming. The spirit of change stirs passions and reactions. It instills an insistence to persevere at the level of intuition and instinct, to fuel what some call a prophetic imagination. It calls for disciples of a movement Jesus would recognize. Disciples prepared to embark on a road where uncertainty and toil gives way to enlightenment and community. A road where fellow travellers sometimes come from unlikely parts. A road wide enough for the refugees from another time in the church to join the march. A road with enough curves to collect the bystanders, the weary, the uncertain, and the rejected. A road that takes us to heaven. I feel very honoured to be with Claire tonight in launching this booklet. It might be thin, but as Claire said, it's weighted with wisdom. These are days for wise people. It's inspiring that so many have given so much of their time over so many years to bring voice to what so many of the 90% feel. And on everyone's behalf tonight, I congratulate all involved. I thank Garrett Publishing for adding another worthy publication to their increasing gallery. And on behalf of us all, congratulations. And with Claire and others, we launched the ship, and I know that most delegates will have it wound up in their back pocket because they'll need it, because we're on the road and changes are coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. That was really fantastic. Like many others, I loved your reminder that we could be a church that's vibrant and relevant, compassionate and nurturing, exciting and free. So thank you for reminding us and keeping that spark alive in our hearts. It's my pleasure now to introduce John Warhurst. John is an emeritus professor at the Australian National University, chair of Concerned Catholics Canberra Goulburn, and a plenary council member. John writes for Eureka Street and the Canberra Times, and is the author of a new book, Wrestling with Church Hierarchy, Engaging with the Plenary Council and Beyond. He was a member of the writing team for Light from the Southern Cross, the report on church governance commissioned by the Australian bishops following the Royal Commission. This evening, John will speak on behalf of the various authors who contributed to the book. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Claire and Francis. It's a great honour to be offered this opportunity on behalf of the authors to respond to Claire and Francis. I'd first like to say that we're all greatly honoured by the remarks that Claire and Francis have made. Like all of you, I'm still digesting and savouring, I think is the word, the strong and poetic words with which Claire and Francis described and discussed a church for all. I'd also like to say that it's an absolute privilege for me to be included in such a distinguished company of authors, Sister Joan Chittister, Deborah Zanella, Robert Fitzgerald, and of course, not to forget, the Australian Catholic Coalition for Church Reform itself. I believe that Sister Joan and Robert are present listening tonight. I thank Claire for reminding us of Vatican II, of emphasising women and Indigenous Australians, of hoping for a welcoming and inclusive church, a representative church, with an emphasis on living and working with the poor, as her own St. Vincent de Paul Society does. I thank Francis for his perspective on renewal and reform. First of all, for his insights into the format and methodologies under which the plenary council will be conducted, it's so important that we concentrate on those methodologies and that format. And Francis's emphasis on a humble church, a vibrant church, a relevant church, above all of these things and many more we've learnt tonight from Francis and Claire, and I'll be savouring them for many days to come, and certainly during the plenary council itself. I'd like to say that we're greatly indebted to the Garrett publishing team, led by Karen Taylor and David Hughan, for producing such a beautiful book in such a remarkably quick time. I've never ever been involved in such an amazing production under such pressure. Thanks to you, Karen, David, and everyone concerned at Garrett's for such a magnificent effort. Your dedication to the cause of church reform, backed up by professionalism of the highest order, is exemplary. And we can all learn, all of us, from this combination of professionalism and urgency. It really was grace under pressure. I also want to pay tribute to all of those within the Australasian Catholic Coalition for Church Reform. 19, now 20 reform groups spread across Australia and New Zealand, many of whose members have been devoted to church reform for a decade. I don't think we should forget that there are many Australian Catholics for whom they're not Johnny-come-latelys. They're ones who've been in the field of church reform for many years. There would have been no book without the imagination and courage of the coalition in setting out on the journey to hold a series of convocations of Catholics during 2021. And there are many to thank within ACCR, but I want to pay tribute especially to the Convocations Project team led by Kevin Liston and South Australian Catholics for an Evolving Church, especially his colleague Kathy McAvoy. And also, of course, to Andrea Dean, our facilitator tonight, who also facilitated Convocations 1 and 2. Kevin and Kathy and Andrea worked with Eleanor Flynn and Peter Johnston, the ACCR co-conveners. And as a team, they drafted and brought together in record time the coalition's response to the plenary council agenda questions. And this forms the final chapter of this booklet. Getting agreement from like-minded but independent reformers and reform groups around the nation on the precise formulation of policy positions and concrete suggestions, because these things need a lot of time in such a short space of time, is never easy, but they managed it. Again, grace under pressure. The urgency came not just because the church is in crisis, as Claire and Francis have reiterated, but we were working to a critical deadline determined by the date of the first assembly of the plenary council in the first week of October. And to engage in a timely fashion with the Catholic community of Australia, especially the almost 300 members of the plenary council, meant that the book had to be ready for wider distribution by the beginning of September. Words and ideas take time to sink in. I mentioned that Claire and Francis's words will be sinking in for some time. And I also think the words and ideas in this booklet will be sinking in over time. But the book now stands as a light to guide the plenary council. And for me, that's the first part of the mission accomplished. The next task, of which this launch is a part, is to spread the word as widely as possible. We need a church for all in the hands, hearts, and thoughts of those plenary council members. And let's not forget their own circles of friends and colleagues and mentors as they all continue their discernment. It's not just the discerning by the members of the plenary council inside the tent, you might say, but it's the discernment by the whole Catholic community which matters. The plenary council members are not isolated individuals and shouldn't and don't, in my experience, see themselves as isolated individuals and we should remember that. I think this is a key point. To have reasoned arguments for change in such a beautifully produced book is one thing, but to make them part of the discernment about the future of the church in Australia, that's the topic for the Plenary Council. The future of the church in Australia is another. It is an even harder and more urgent task. To do that, all Catholics, all of us, must understand, as Francis has begun to discuss, the special, quite unique dynamics of the Plenary Council Assembly. In particular, the methodologies of spiritual conversations, deep listening, Ignatian discernment. These methodologies are not widely known or appreciated, but must be learnt by all of us if we are to track the process and outcomes of the Plenary Council. The pace may be slower than some of us wish, but we all need to be resilient and hang in for that long journey. We must fight against the status quo, obfuscation and delay, and tackle head-on the crisis in our church. And this means spreading these words in a church for all. And I'd like to conclude by reflecting on the final two words of the title, and beyond. These are very important words because they make the point that while the Plenary Council First Assembly in the first week of October is an opportunity for reform to begin, it's just one opportunity. There are opportunities all around us in our communities of faith around Australia, and there will be in the future. The words "and beyond" can refer firstly to the next 9 months, until and including the second Plenary Council Assembly in July 2022. These months will, of course, be ones of intense activity. But realistically, they refer to many years, perhaps many decades, during which the discernment and implementation of church reform must take place in parishes, religious communities, and dioceses right across Australia, and dare I say it, in all our hearts. Reformers must be steeled for this large task. A church for all is a guide for that longer journey, not just for the next few weeks. In Sister Joan Chittis's words, repeated on the cover, stand up, speak up. I would add, and I'm sure Sister Joan speaks in this spirit, keep standing up, keep speaking out, and lean in and engage with the Plenary Council as it comes before us. Thank you for the opportunity to respond on behalf of the authors.
Thank you, John. That was just fantastic. I loved that little reflection, and beyond. And I'm not sure if you were aware of the significance of mentioning the next 9 months. Such an apt period of time for gestation as we do look to the years and the decades ahead. Thank you so much, John, for your words and for your contribution to this piece of work and to all you've done and given already to the reform movement. Thank you. I'd like to give you a chance, the audience, to submit some questions. So there is a Q&A box and there is also a chat bar. So you're welcome to submit a question perhaps to one of the speakers. So we'll give you a chance to pop your thoughts in there. And Tracy, I think there have already been 1 or 2 questions there. So if you wouldn't mind harvesting 1 or 2 for me and perhaps direct them to one of our speakers, please.
There's an initial question. The question is, why does there seem to be no invitation for people to contribute to the development of concrete proposals? Surely this task can't be left to a couple of 100 members. John, knowing your experience with the procedures of the council, did you want to respond to that one?
Yes, I'm happy to. There is in fact an invitation to all Catholics to contribute concrete proposals. And I hope that not just ACCR, but Catholics around Australia do that. Rest assured, the questioner, that these concrete proposals will reach the plenary council members. It sometimes seems a great divide between those who are inside the council and the vast majority of Catholics around the country. And I would urge everyone to contact plenary council members, to contact the plenary council authorities, the facilitation team. Materials are being put up on the resources for the plenary council members within the structure of the plenary council, and it's certainly not too late to do that. In fact, the next 3 weeks should be a time of intense activity.
There's another question here from Alison Burt, and she says, following on from Joan Chichester's comment about the need for deep listening, what are the hallmarks of this, and what impedes or facilitates deep listening, and what is required of each individual? And I'm not quite sure where that could go. You know, Francis, did you want to respond to that one, or maybe Claire?
I think Andrea is probably the best person to answer this question, to be honest. How about you, Andrea?
Sure. Thanks, Alison, for the question. And it was certainly a treat for us to have Miriam Rose speak to us directly at the beginning of the last convocation about deep listening. And it is, I think, a wonderful foundational resource for us as Australian Catholics to know that the Indigenous tradition of deep listening is so in harmony with the church tradition of discernment, and now this approach that Pope Francis is promoting of synodality. So there certainly is an overlap between those three processes. And I guess all I could say, I can't see your question, so I'm not sure I can remember all the sections of it, but what might be required, I think the first thing is openness of heart. So there are other processes that talk about open mind, open heart, open will. And I think all of those dimensions are part of the listening task as we move from holding on to our own points of view to hearing and seeing another's position as worthwhile, and by listening more broadly to understanding that sense of community, that we are all children of God, and to work towards resolutions which are building on each person's point of view. I think in our last convocation, Jessie Rogers introduced the term to me of overflow, which I've since discovered in Pope Francis's writings, that if we are really open to the movement of the Spirit, the answer becomes more than the sum of any one individual. The action of the Spirit kind of harnesses all the possibilities together and can move us into a place that individually we can't possibly imagine.
Thanks so much, Andrea. I'm just, you know, there's quite a few questions coming in, but this one, actually, this is from Ruth in Melbourne, and Ruth asks, did I dream this? Is the plenary council going to be live streamed? And it would be useful to know how to participate as observers in this way. Does anyone know whether that is a dream or whether that is something that is going to happen?
Perhaps I can begin to answer that. Yes, parts of each day will be live streamed. They will essentially be the plenary sessions, or parts of the plenary sessions, when all of the delegates members get together. And as for its advertising, I would only assume we should clock in on the websites of the ACBC and the plenary council itself to be able to join those links. But they will be done. Perhaps I would also add that I think most is the word, much of the plenary council will be conducted in small groups. And that's an essential part of both the deep listening in the earlier question and the discussion of the format of the plenary council, so that much of the listening that the plenary council members do will be to 10 or 12 other plenary council members discussing a particular topic at some length day after day during the first assembly of the plenary council. But look out for the live streaming as it exists, and also look out for Zoom conferences each evening of the plenary council, which will be offered by the Australian Catholic Coalition for Church Reform and Concerned Catholics Canberra-Goulburn, as a contribution to increasing the transparency of the plenary council and to just bringing people inside the council as far as is possible on a daily basis.
Thanks so much, John. Like there are a lot of questions coming through about different procedures regarding the council, and maybe that's something that we can address in a different forum, in a different way, Andrea. I'm not sure about that. There's a question here for a couple of questions here for you, Francis. It said, in your presentation, you indicated that the plenary council being jeopardised in the middle of an ongoing discernment process. Can you unpack that for us? And just to kind of merge in another question that's here as well. So I'm trying to do this on the fly. You know, it says, you know, your preamble, you know, although you offered hope, was a bit disheartening. You know, has it gone too wrong already, I guess, is what people are asking. You know, you indicated that there was, you know, things had gone off track, and, you know, can you unpack that for us? And I guess the second part of the question is, has it gone too wrong?
I think what I was trying to express firstly is that we need to have our eyes wide open about what this process is really about. It is a completely controlled process. It's controlled by the bishops and the structures of canon law. This is not just an open talk fest. When we thought it was going to be an opportunity to put all reform issues on the table, they have, the ones that are too difficult for the bishops to handle have been removed in effect. It means that if we're going to have those conversations, we need to be forthright ourselves and step up, as John just said, and speak out. And so there is that tension between being, as a lot of Catholics always are, very compliant, as opposed to taking our own agency in the processes. It will mean that some of the conversations need to be forthright and obviously respectful, but forthright. And it doesn't mean that we simply go along with an agenda or a series of issues that we don't feel hit the mark. That's the point in the beginning about, I understand it's the point about trying to listen carefully to what people are talking about and listen underneath that to what maybe are my own biases, my own, if you like, perspective, and maybe what I have to hear in the other. But at the same time, I have a lived experience and truth that needs to come forward and be in the discussion. I have to articulate the experiences of my family and my friends who have been brought up in the Catholic Church but have their own issues around it. I have to be, as Claire said, articulating what we see when we go out and serve. In other words, I was particularly keen for us to be mindful of the fact that so many of our fellow Catholics don't travel with us these days. And you've got to ask why. And it's not enough to just give an academic answer. We have to respect that lived experience. These are good people trying to live good lives. And I don't want to get into an us and them. And I certainly don't want to get into what we heard throughout the 80s and 90s about authentic Catholics and those that aren't. If we're going to drop into that, we're going to have a very difficult time. So that was the first part of it. But I have to say I'm an optimist. I really am an optimist, because in the sessions of leading up to this that they've been offering sort of information nights, I keep on running into people like me. Now, I know that frightens some of you, but the point is there's a lot of people that share the same spirit. And I really do believe that together things will change.
We've run out of time.
We have, but is there a kind of a simple question that might be a brief one?
No, but what I might do is just kind of summarise some of the questions and comments that people have been making. And there's a lot of questions about synodality and about how, as lay people, we can begin to practice synodality and really listen to people of other faiths and people, you know, who aren't in the church as such. And I think that's very much speaking to what you were talking about, Claire, you know, in reaching out to the other, in like the really important work that St. Vincent de Paul does. So I'm really sorry that we can't get to all the questions, because there's some really great ones here which I would like to hear the answer to as well. So another day, another time, Andrea.
Thanks, Tracy. Thank you, everybody. We might try and answer some questions through the chat or by the Q&A if possible. We do have a short paper that Dr. Jessie Rogers presented at the last convocation. I might put it to the coalition to see whether we could distribute that or make that available on our website, since it's not included in the publication. And I know that many of us have found Pope Francis's very approachable, accessible book, Let Us Dream, very helpful in terms of understanding synodality. I recommend that to you. So it's my task now to hand over to publisher extraordinaire David Hughan from John Carrot for details on the book's availability. Over to you, David.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea. I'm very rarely called extraordinaire, but I will take it. That's not usually the term that my team would use to describe me. I join you today from Wurundjeri land here in Melbourne, and like others, I give my complete and utter honour to those past, present and emerging leaders. This book, as publishers, I hold up our mission as to be agents of change. That's what publishers have been about since day one. And in being involved and having the honour of working with such passionate people who have driven and continue to drive, continue to strive for church reform, yeah, it's been a complete honour. And Andrea just mentioned, Let Us Dream. And one of the key quotes that I saw out of that book that sort of led to the genesis and thinking about a church for all was Pope Francis's quote being, "A church that teaches must be firstly a church that listens. What affects all should be discussed by all." And our desire, our hope, our dream in creating resources and books and having the honour of having people like John and like Sister Joan and like Robert Fitzgerald, it's a true honour, and Deborah, it's a true honour for a publisher to be entrusted with their works. So I thank them very much. I also wish to thank my wonderful publishing director. The genesis of this book from the idea, inception, to its release was 6 weeks. That's unheard of, I think, in publishing circles, where even a 9-month cycle is a challenge. I thank very much Francis and Claire. I thank Tracy, I thank John, and I thank Andrea for their participation tonight. We are very, very grateful. And a small ad, I'd be remiss not to do it. For those of you who wish to buy a copy of the book, as Francis suggested, thank you for that. Just go to garrettpublishing.com.au or garratt.com.au, and you'll be able to purchase the book. If you'd like to purchase multiple copies of the book, then let sales@garrettpublishing.com.au know, or me at david@garrettpublishing.com.au. I thank everybody for taking some time out of their day. I thank our presenters tonight for their impassioned words, and I truly appreciate them involved in launching our little book. We hope that it makes change and it creates change, and I'm sure it will. Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you, David, and thank you, everyone. It's been an incredible evening, almost as great as the convocations that we've shared together. So thank you again, everybody. Thank you to our audience. We have at the moment 333 people in the audience, and many people who will watch the recording of the book launch because they were unable to be here tonight. So we thank you for your support, and we thank you for everyone who's been involved. I'm sure really that something has already been unleashed here, that regardless of formal meetings, that a fire has been lit in our hearts, and that this movement of the Spirit will be of great benefit to the church and to Australia as a whole. Thank you, everybody. God bless, and I hope to see you at the next convocation in November on the 18th. Check out the website for the coalition, which is www.accccr.com.au. And if you have any trouble finding us, just search for any one of our presenters tonight, and I'm sure we'll pass on the relevant details to you. Good night and God bless. Thank you.